Open the door now!
Who is it? Please, why are you here?
Open it immediately or I'll force entry!
I'm calling the police.
Do it! Open the door right now!
The doorbell camera had been recording for exactly 43 seconds when the pounding started. What began as a peaceful Tuesday evening in a quiet residential neighborhood was about to become a viral sensation that would destroy one man's career and change an elderly woman's life forever. The footage that emerged from this seemingly ordinary apartment complex would rack up over 15 million views in just 4 days, spark nationwide outrage, and prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon against abuse of power is a simple security camera that costs less than $50. The woman at the center of this storm was named Dorothy, a 78-year-old retired librarian who had lived in the same apartment for over 20 years. She was the kind of neighbor who baked cookies for new residents and always had a kind word for the mail carrier. Her husband had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving her to navigate life alone in their modest one-bedroom apartment. Dorothy kept to herself mostly, spending her days reading, tending to her small collection of houseplants, and video calling with her grandchildren who lived across the country. That Tuesday evening, Dorothy had just finished watching her favorite cooking show when she decided to turn in early. She had taken her evening medications, brushed her teeth, and settled into bed with a mystery novel. By 9:30, she was fast asleep, completely unaware that her peaceful night was about to be shattered in the most terrifying way possible. Officer Daniel Rodriguez had been patrolling the area for about 2 hours when he received what would later be described as a routine noise complaint. Someone had called in about loud music coming from apartment 4B at the Maple Grove complex. The caller claimed the music had been going on for hours and was disturbing other residents. Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran of the force, decided to investigate. What happened next would become the subject of intense scrutiny and legal action that would expose a pattern of behavior that had somehow gone unchecked for years. Rodriguez arrived at the complex at approximately 10:15 in the evening. He parked his patrol car and walked up to the second floor where apartment 4B was located. Here's where the story takes its first crucial turn. Dorothy lived in apartment 4D, not 4B. The apartments were clearly marked, and any reasonable person could easily distinguish between the two. But Rodriguez, for reasons that would later be questioned extensively, approached the wrong door. Dorothy's apartment was completely silent. No music, no television, no sounds of any kind. The elderly woman was fast asleep in her bedroom, which was located at the back of the unit, far from the front door. The doorbell camera that Dorothy had installed just 6 months earlier captured everything that followed. She had purchased the device after her neighbor mentioned how useful they were for package deliveries. Dorothy rarely received unexpected visitors, but she liked the peace of mind that came with being able to see who was at her door without having to get up. The footage shows Rodriguez standing outside Dorothy's door for several minutes. He appears to be listening, looking around, and checking his notes. Then, he begins knocking. The knocks start normally, but within seconds they become much louder and more aggressive. The camera picks up the sound clearly, and it's obvious that these weren't polite requests for attention. These were demanding, authoritative pounds that would wake anyone in the immediate vicinity. Dorothy woke up confused and frightened. In her groggy state, she couldn't immediately process what was happening. The knocking continued, getting louder and more insistent. She looked at her bedside clock and saw that it was past 10:30. Nobody she knew would visit at this hour. Her heart started racing as she considered the possibilities. Was there an emergency? Was someone in trouble? She slowly got out of bed, put on her robe, and made her way to the front door. The pounding continued the entire time, never letting up, never giving her a chance to collect herself or respond. By the time she reached the door, she was genuinely scared. She called out, asking who was there. This is where Rodriguez made his first major mistake. Instead of identifying himself properly as a police officer and explaining why he was there, he simply demanded that she open the door. His voice was aggressive and impatient. He told her to open up immediately. Dorothy, a woman who had lived through enough decades to recognize when something wasn't right, asked again who was at the door and what they wanted. Rodriguez became more agitated. The camera captured him stepping closer to the door, raising his voice and making threats about what would happen if she didn't comply. He never once mentioned that he was investigating a noise complaint. He never explained that he was responding to a call about loud music. He simply demanded entry into her home. Dorothy, now genuinely terrified, told him through the door that she was going to call the police. This statement would later become crucial evidence in the legal proceedings that followed. Here was an elderly woman, frightened in her own home, telling someone at her door that she needed to call the police for help. The irony was lost on Rodriguez in that moment. What happened next shocked everyone who later viewed the footage. Instead of identifying himself as a police officer and de-escalating the situation, Rodriguez became enraged. He began threatening to break down the door. He told Dorothy that she had no choice but to let him in. His language became increasingly inappropriate and intimidating. Dorothy retreated from the door and did exactly what any reasonable person would do in that situation. She called 911. The emergency call would later be played in court, and the fear in her voice was unmistakable. She reported that someone was trying to force their way into her apartment, that they were threatening her, and that she was scared for her safety. The 911 operator tried to calm her down and gather information. Dorothy explained that she was alone, that it was late at night, and that someone was pounding on her door demanding entry. She said she had no idea who it was or what they wanted. The operator assured her that help was on the way and advised her to stay on the line. Meanwhile, outside her door, Rodriguez was losing what little patience he had left. The doorbell camera captured him pacing back and forth, speaking angrily into his radio and continuing to pound on the door intermittently. At one point, he tried the door handle to see if it was unlocked. When he found that it wasn't, his frustration became even more apparent. Then he made the decision that would ultimately cost him everything. Without any legal justification, without a warrant, and without any reasonable belief that Dorothy was in danger or committing a crime, Rodriguez decided to force entry into her apartment. The camera shows him stepping back from the door and then charging forward with his shoulder. The impact was tremendous. Dorothy, still on the phone with the emergency operator, screamed as the door burst open. The sound was captured clearly on both the doorbell camera and the 911 recording. Rodriguez stormed into the apartment, immediately encountering a terrified elderly woman in her nightgown and robe. The doorbell camera, now triggered by the commotion, continued recording as Rodriguez entered the frame. His face was clearly visible, his badge number was readable, and his aggressive demeanor was unmistakable. Dorothy was backing away from him, still holding her phone, still connected to the 911 operator. She was asking what he wanted, why he had broken into her home, and pleading with him to leave. The fear in her voice was heartbreaking to anyone who later heard the recordings. Rodriguez seemed to suddenly realize the magnitude of what he had done. The apartment was clearly not the source of any noise complaint. There was no loud music, no party, no disturbance of any kind. It was the quiet home of an elderly woman who had been sleeping peacefully until he had terrorized her. But instead of immediately apologizing and explaining his mistake, Rodriguez doubled down. He demanded to know if anyone else was in the apartment. He asked Dorothy why she hadn't opened the door when he first knocked. He treated her like a suspect rather than a victim of his own incompetence. The 911 operator, still listening to everything happening, dispatched additional units to the scene. Dorothy kept trying to explain to Rodriguez that she had been asleep, that she didn't know why he was there, and that she wanted him to leave. She showed remarkable composure for someone who had just experienced such a terrifying ordeal. Within minutes, other officers began arriving at the scene. The first to arrive was Officer Sarah Kim, a supervisor who immediately recognized that something was seriously wrong. She found Rodriguez standing in Dorothy's living room while the elderly woman sat in a chair, visibly shaken and still in her nightclothes. Kim asked Rodriguez what was happening and why he was inside the apartment without invitation or warrant. Rodriguez tried to explain about the noise complaint, but Kim quickly realized that he was in the wrong apartment entirely. She looked around at the quiet, orderly home and then at the terrified woman whose door had just been broken down. Kim immediately began damage control. She apologized to Dorothy explained that there had been a terrible mistake, and assured her that the situation was being taken seriously. She radioed for a supervisor and requested that someone contact the apartment complex management about repairing Dorothy's door, which was now hanging off its hinges. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? Type yes in the comments if you have. Dorothy's doorbell camera had captured everything. The extended period of aggressive knocking, the threats, the forced entry, and Rodriguez's behavior afterward. The footage was automatically uploaded to the cloud, creating a permanent record of everything that had transpired. What Dorothy didn't know at the time was that this wouldn't be the end of her ordeal. What she also didn't know was that Officer Rodriguez had a history of complaints that had somehow been overlooked or dismissed by his department. And what absolutely nobody could have predicted was how the release of that doorbell camera footage would expose a pattern of misconduct that went far beyond one officer's bad judgment on one terrible night. The real apartment where the noise complaint had originated was never identified that evening. No loud music was ever found. No disturbance was ever located. The entire incident had been based on either a mistaken address or a false report, and it had resulted in the traumatization of an innocent elderly woman who had done nothing wrong except try to sleep peacefully in her own home. The next morning, Dorothy woke up in her daughter's guest bedroom, unable to return to her own apartment because the door was still broken. Her daughter Lisa had driven 4 hours through the night after receiving a frantic phone call about what had happened. Dorothy had barely slept, replaying the terrifying moments when her door exploded inward and a strange man invaded her sanctuary. Lisa was furious. She had served in the military for 12 years and understood the proper protocols for law enforcement interactions. What had happened to her mother was not only wrong, it was criminal. She immediately began documenting everything, taking photos of the damaged door, requesting copies of the police reports, and most importantly, downloading the footage from her mother's doorbell camera. When Lisa first watched the video, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The aggressive knocking, the threats, the complete lack of proper identification, and finally the forced entry into her mother's home. She watched it multiple times, each viewing making her angrier and more determined to seek justice for what had been done to Dorothy. The apartment complex management was equally shocked when they reviewed the footage. They had installed security cameras throughout the property, but none had captured the incident as clearly as Dorothy's personal doorbell camera. The property manager, a woman named Jennifer, had worked in property management for over 20 years and had never seen anything like this. Jennifer immediately contacted the police department to file a formal complaint and demand answers. She also arranged for Dorothy's door to be repaired that same day, though she knew that fixing the physical damage was the least of their concerns. The psychological trauma that Dorothy had endured couldn't be repaired with new hardware and a fresh coat of paint. Meanwhile, Officer Rodriguez was having the worst day of his career. His supervisor had already begun an internal investigation, and the preliminary findings were not looking good for him. The department's policy manual clearly stated that forced entry into a residence required either a warrant, consent, or exigent circumstances. None of these conditions had been met. Rodriguez tried to justify his actions by claiming he believed someone inside the apartment might be in danger. But this explanation fell apart when investigators reviewed the timeline. He had spent several minutes outside the door, listening and observing. There had been no sounds of distress, no indications of violence, and no emergency that would justify breaking down the door of an elderly woman's home. The Internal Affairs Division requested all available footage and documentation. They obtained the 911 recording of Dorothy's terrified call, the doorbell camera video, and statements from all officers who responded to the scene. They also began reviewing Rodriguez's history with the department. What they found was disturbing. Rodriguez had received numerous complaints over the years, but somehow they had never been properly investigated or addressed. Citizens had reported aggressive behavior, improper searches, and intimidation tactics. Multiple people had accused him of racial profiling and excessive force, yet he had continued to patrol the streets with minimal oversight. One complaint from 2 years earlier described an incident remarkably similar to what had happened to Dorothy. A young mother had called police about suspicious activity in her neighborhood. When Rodriguez arrived, he had somehow gotten the address wrong and had attempted to search the home of an innocent family. That complaint had been dismissed as a misunderstanding. Another complaint detailed how Rodriguez had detained a teenage boy for over an hour without cause, searching his backpack and questioning him aggressively about gang activity. The boy had been walking home from basketball practice at his school. That complaint had resulted in a brief suspension that Rodriguez had successfully appealed. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to look at it objectively. Rodriguez had a history of poor judgment, aggressive behavior, and violations of citizens' rights. Yet somehow he had managed to avoid serious consequences for 15 years. Dorothy spent the next few days staying with her daughter, too frightened to return to her own apartment. She had lived independently for 78 years, surviving the Great Depression, World War II, the death of her husband, and countless other challenges. But this single incident had shaken her confidence in a way that nothing else had. She found herself jumping at unexpected sounds, checking locks multiple times, and feeling anxious whenever someone knocked on the door. The violation of her home had been more than just a physical intrusion. It had been an attack on her sense of safety and security in the one place where she should have felt most protected. Lisa researched attorneys who specialized in police misconduct cases. She found a law firm that had successfully represented victims of civil rights violations and scheduled a consultation. The attorney, Rebecca Martinez, reviewed the doorbell camera footage and immediately recognized the strength of Dorothy's case. Martinez had seen plenty of police misconduct videos, but this one was particularly egregious because of how clearly it documented every aspect of the violation. The extended period of aggressive knocking, the threats, the forced entry, and Rodriguez's behavior afterward were all captured in high definition with clear audio. She explained to Dorothy and Lisa that they had grounds for both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit. The criminal charges would need to be pursued by the district attorney's office, but the civil case could seek damages for the violation of Dorothy's constitutional rights, the trauma she had endured, and the ongoing impact on her life. The attorney also recommended that they release the footage to local media outlets. She had found that public pressure often motivated police departments to take misconduct cases more seriously than they might otherwise. Dorothy was hesitant about becoming a public figure, but Lisa convinced her that speaking out might prevent this from happening to someone else. The local news station that first aired the story couldn't believe what they were seeing. The footage was so clear and the violation so obvious that they knew immediately this would be a major story. They contacted the police department for comment, but received only a generic statement about ongoing investigations. The story broke on a Thursday evening newscast and immediately began gaining traction. Social media users shared the footage widely, expressing outrage at what had been done to an innocent elderly woman. The hashtag #DorothyJustice began trending locally and then spread to national platforms. By Friday morning, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. The combination of clear video evidence and sympathetic victim and obvious police misconduct created the perfect storm for viral content. The doorbell camera footage was being viewed millions of times across various platforms. Rodriguez was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, but this only increased public anger. People couldn't understand why he was receiving paid time off for what appeared to be clear criminal behavior. Protesters began gathering outside the police department, demanding his immediate termination and criminal prosecution. The police chief, under intense pressure from both the public and city officials, held a press conference to address the situation. She acknowledged that the incident was deeply troubling and promised a thorough investigation. She also announced that the department would be reviewing its policies regarding forced entry and officer accountability, but her carefully worded statements did little to calm public outrage. People wanted immediate action, not promises of future reviews. They wanted Rodriguez fired and charged with breaking and entering, assault, and violation of civil rights. They wanted the supervisors who had ignored his previous complaints to be held accountable as well. The district attorney's office found itself under similar pressure to file criminal charges. The video evidence was overwhelming, and the public was demanding justice. They announced that they would present the case to a grand jury, which would determine whether formal charges should be filed. Dorothy watched the news coverage from her daughter's house, amazed at how much attention her story was receiving. She had never sought to become a public figure, but she was gratified to see that people were taking her ordeal seriously. She hoped that the attention would lead to changes that would protect other innocent people from experiencing what she had endured. The apartment complex where Dorothy lived also found itself in the spotlight. Other residents came forward with their own stories about Rodriguez and other officers who had behaved inappropriately in their community. It became clear that Dorothy's experience was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of misconduct. Local civil rights organizations joined the call for justice, organizing rallies and demanding comprehensive police reform. They pointed to Dorothy's case as an example of why oversight and accountability were so desperately needed in law enforcement. As the story continued to gain national attention, legal experts began weighing in on the significance of the case. Many noted that doorbell cameras and other consumer recording devices were becoming powerful tools for documenting police misconduct. They predicted that Dorothy's case would likely result in significant legal and financial consequences for both Rodriguez and his department. The pressure was building from all directions, and it was becoming clear that this would not be another case of police misconduct that was quietly swept under the rug. The video evidence was too clear, the violation too obvious, and the public outrage too intense for the usual bureaucratic delays and excuses. Rodriguez's career was hanging by a thread, and he knew it. His attorney advised him to remain silent and avoid making any public statements that might further damage his case. But privately, Rodriguez was beginning to realize that his 15-year career in law enforcement was likely over, regardless of whether criminal charges were ultimately filed. The investigation was moving forward rapidly, driven by the undeniable evidence captured by a $50 doorbell camera that had been installed to help an elderly woman see who was delivering her packages. The grand jury proceedings began 3 weeks after the footage went viral, and the evidence presented was overwhelming. Prosecutors played the doorbell camera video multiple times, each viewing making Rodriguez's actions appear more indefensible. The audio quality was crystal clear, capturing every threat he had made and every terrified response from Dorothy. The grand jury also heard testimony from Dorothy herself, who described the lasting impact of that night on her daily life. She spoke about how she could no longer sleep peacefully, how every unexpected sound made her heart race, and how she had been forced to leave the apartment she had called home for 2 decades. Her voice trembled as she described the moment her door exploded inward and a stranger invaded her sanctuary. They heard from Officer Kim, who testified about finding Rodriguez standing in Dorothy's living room without any legal justification for being there. Kim's testimony was particularly damaging because she was a fellow officer who couldn't defend Rodriguez's actions. She described his inability to explain why he had forced entry and his apparent confusion when confronted with the reality that he was in the wrong apartment. The grand jury also reviewed Rodriguez's personnel file, which painted a picture of an officer who had been allowed to operate with minimal oversight despite numerous red flags. The pattern of complaints, the lack of proper investigations, and the absence of meaningful discipline created a timeline of institutional failure that extended far beyond one bad night. On a rainy Thursday morning, the grand jury returned their decision. They voted to indict Rodriguez on multiple felony charges, including breaking and entering, assault, violation of civil rights under color of authority, and official misconduct. Each charge carried the potential for significant prison time and would effectively end any possibility of him working in law enforcement again. The announcement of the indictment was met with celebration from Dorothy's supporters and civil rights advocates who had been following the case. But it was only the beginning of Rodriguez's legal troubles. The criminal charges were just one part of a much larger reckoning that was about to unfold. Dorothy's civil lawsuit was moving forward simultaneously with the criminal case. Her attorney had assembled a team of experts who documented every aspect of the violation and its ongoing impact on Dorothy's life. Medical professionals testified about the psychological trauma she had endured. Security experts explained how Rodriguez's actions violated every standard protocol for law enforcement interactions with civilians. The city's insurance company quickly recognized that this was not a case they could win at trial. The video evidence was too clear, the violation too obvious, and the victim too sympathetic. They began pushing for a settlement that would avoid the additional bad publicity of a lengthy trial. Rodriguez's own department was conducting its internal investigation, though the outcome was becoming increasingly predictable. His superiors were scrambling to distance themselves from him while also trying to avoid liability for their years of inadequate oversight. Internal emails obtained through discovery revealed that multiple supervisors had been aware of Rodriguez's problematic behavior, but had failed to take meaningful action. One email chain was particularly damning. It showed a conversation between two lieutenants from the previous year discussing Rodriguez's aggressive tendencies and his pattern of complaints from minority residents. Despite acknowledging these concerns, they had decided to simply transfer him to a different patrol area rather than address the underlying issues. The media attention continued to intensify as more details emerged about Rodriguez's history and the department's failure to properly supervise him. Investigative journalists uncovered additional incidents that had never been properly documented or investigated. They found witnesses who had been too intimidated to file formal complaints, and victims who had been discouraged from pursuing their cases. One particularly troubling discovery involved a traffic stop from the previous summer where Rodriguez had allegedly used excessive force against a college student. The incident had been witnessed by several people, but their complaints had been dismissed without investigation. The student had been too frightened and overwhelmed to pursue the matter further. Another case involved an elderly man who claimed Rodriguez had entered his home without permission while responding to a medical emergency call. The man's family had tried to file a complaint, but they were told that Rodriguez's actions were justified by the emergency nature of the call. The doorbell camera footage from Dorothy's case now casts serious doubt on that explanation. The police union initially tried to defend Rodriguez, issuing statements about the difficult and dangerous nature of police work. But as more evidence emerged and public pressure mounted, even they began to distance themselves from him. The union's lawyer quietly advised Rodriguez that they would not be able to provide the robust defense they typically offered to officers facing misconduct charges. Rodriguez hired a private attorney using his savings and retirement funds, but his legal options were severely limited by the video evidence. His lawyer's strategy focused primarily on trying to minimize the potential criminal penalties rather than disputing what had happened. They argued that Rodriguez had made an honest mistake under stressful circumstances and that his actions, while wrong, did not rise to the level of criminal intent required for the most serious charges. This defense strategy fell apart when prosecutors introduced evidence of Rodriguez's history of similar incidents. The pattern showed that this was not an isolated mistake, but part of a long-standing disregard for citizens' rights and proper police procedures. The jury would ultimately be asked to decide whether someone with 15 years of law enforcement experience could repeatedly make the same honest mistakes without criminal intent. Dorothy's psychological evaluation revealed the full extent of the trauma she had endured. The clinical psychologist who examined her documented symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares, anxiety attacks, and a persistent fear of being alone in her home. The evaluation noted that these symptoms were particularly severe given Dorothy's age and previously stable mental health. The financial impact on Dorothy was also significant. She had been forced to stay in hotels and with family members because she couldn't bear to return to her apartment. She required ongoing counseling and medical treatment for anxiety. Her previously independent lifestyle had been completely disrupted, requiring her to rely on others for support and assistance she had never needed before. The apartment complex where Dorothy lived found itself drawn into the legal proceedings as well. Dorothy's attorneys argued that the property management company had a duty to protect residents from foreseeable harm, including misconduct by law enforcement officers. They pointed to the company's failure to properly screen the officers who regularly patrolled their property and their inadequate response to previous complaints about Rodriguez. The complex's insurance company hired its own legal team to defend against these claims, but they too recognized the strength of Dorothy's case. The video evidence made it impossible to argue that Rodriguez's actions were reasonable or that the harm to Dorothy was unforeseeable. They began negotiating their own settlement to limit their exposure. Meanwhile, the criminal trial was scheduled to begin 6 months after the indictment. Rodriguez's attorney filed numerous motions trying to exclude evidence or dismiss charges, but the judge rejected most of them. The video evidence was ruled admissible, as were the details of Rodriguez's history of complaints and misconduct. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They would show the jury the doorbell camera footage, play the 911 recording of Dorothy's terrified call for help, and present testimony from the officers who responded to clean up Rodriguez's mess. They would demonstrate that his actions violated clearly established constitutional rights and that he had no legal justification for forcing entry into Dorothy's home. Rodriguez's defense team struggled to find witnesses willing to testify on his behalf. Many of his fellow officers were unwilling to risk their own careers by defending obviously indefensible conduct. His supervisors were more concerned with protecting themselves than supporting him. Even character witnesses from his personal life were reluctant to associate themselves with such a high-profile case of police misconduct. The civil settlement negotiations were progressing more quickly than the criminal case. Dorothy's attorneys had calculated damages exceeding $1 million based on her medical expenses, ongoing treatment needs, loss of enjoyment of life, and the violation of her constitutional rights. The city's insurance company was facing the prospect of a trial where they would have to defend the indefensible in front of a jury that would certainly sympathize with an elderly woman whose home had been invaded. 3 months before the scheduled criminal trial, the city made a settlement offer that shocked everyone involved in the case. They proposed paying Dorothy $865,000 to resolve all civil claims against Rodriguez and the police department. The offer included no admission of wrongdoing, but it represented one of the largest settlements in the city's history for a police misconduct case. Dorothy's attorneys advised her that the offer was exceptionally generous and reflected the city's recognition that they had no viable defense to her claims. The doorbell camera footage had created an airtight case that would almost certainly result in a larger verdict if the case went to trial. They recommended accepting the settlement to avoid the stress and uncertainty of a lengthy legal battle. Dorothy herself was conflicted about the settlement. Part of her wanted her day in court, wanted to tell her story publicly and ensure that everyone understood what Rodriguez had done to her. But she was also exhausted by the legal process and eager to move forward with her life. The settlement would provide financial security and allow her to focus on healing rather than litigation. After consulting with her family and considering her options carefully, Dorothy decided to accept the settlement. She issued a public statement explaining her decision and expressing hope that the case would lead to meaningful reforms in police training and accountability. She emphasized that her fight had never been about money, but about ensuring that what happened to her wouldn't happen to others. The settlement announcement sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. $865,000 for a single incident of misconduct was unprecedented in their jurisdiction. Police chiefs across the region began reviewing their own department's policies and procedures, recognizing that the days of covering up officer misconduct were rapidly coming to an end. The settlement also marked a turning point for Rodriguez himself. With his career in ruins and facing serious criminal charges, he found himself in an impossible position. His legal fees were mounting, his reputation was destroyed, and his prospects for any kind of meaningful employment were virtually non-existent. The doorbell camera footage had made him one of the most recognizable faces of police misconduct in the country. His wife filed for divorce 3 weeks after the settlement was announced. She had stood by him initially, believing his version of events and hoping that somehow the truth would vindicate him. But as more evidence emerged and additional victims came forward with their own stories, she could no longer ignore the reality of who her husband had become. The stress of the situation, combined with the financial burden and social isolation, had made their marriage unsustainable. Rodriguez's children faced harassment at school as their classmates discovered their connection to the viral video. Teachers tried to protect them, but the internet had made anonymity impossible. The family was forced to relocate to another state where Rodriguez's notoriety was less pronounced, though even there, a simple Google search would reveal everything. So there you have it. A $50 doorbell camera brought down a 15-year police veteran and resulted in one of the largest misconduct settlements in city history. Dorothy's courage to fight back didn't just get her justice, it exposed a broken system and protected countless future victims. Sometimes the smallest devices capture the biggest truths. If you think this situation was bad, wait until you see what happens in the case on the right-hand side.